Hi everyone and welcome to Cherry Red TV. In the mid-1980s, Mike Stock, Matt Aitken and Pete Waterman came together to head up a talented group of independent writers and producers and achieve a stunning run of hit singles, many of which were released on their own PWL Records imprint. Joining me today to look back at the PWL story is producer and mixmaster supreme Phil Harding. Phil was a key part of the team during those heady days and has written a book entitled PWL From the Factory Floor, which is a wonderfully in-depth look across the era. Phil, welcome.
Thanks, Matt. Nice to be here.
So we're going to focus mainly on the PWL part of your career today.
Sure.
But to start us off, can you give us a brief history of your musical life, sort of up to the point where you began working with Stock, Aitken and Waterman?
Sure, yeah. While I was in a couple of sort of school bands and that sort of stuff around 14, 15 years of age, and when my careers officer asked me what I wanted to do at 16, having decided not to do A-levels, I said I want to be in the music industry and work in a recording studio. And surprisingly enough, he sent me off to a couple of interviews in London for not really recording studios, but other things. But one was a place that was in front of the Marquee club and studios that sold kind of leads and connecting cables and so on. And they said to me, "We don't think you've got the technical ability to work for us, but we hear the studio next door is looking for a T-boy." And got straight onto the phone when I got home, had an interview the next day, and got the job the day after that. This was during the summer, having done my GCSEs. So I was very lucky to start as a 16-year-old as a T-boy in the Marquee Studios behind the famous Marquee Club. And as doesn't happen these days, I trained on the job as an engineer, kept my sort of musical enthusiasm for performing and composing going, and worked my way through as an engineer and got my reputation established at the Marquee Studios. And in the early days of my engineering, I did quite a lot of work for Pete Waterman and his former partner Peter Collins on their various productions that they did for Stiff Records. People like Tracy Allman and Roman Holiday, various other artists. And in those early days, I engineered some sessions for The Clash, quite a few other sort of rock bands, Killing Joke. I got quite established as a rock engineer, and then along came dance in the late 70s, sorry, and got quite into doing a lot of dance and pop. And by the time we approached the early 80s, I'd kind of moved from doing rock projects through to doing mainly pop projects for Stiff and for all sorts of labels, and had, in the early days, got into doing 12-inch club mixes and stuff like that with Pete Waterman himself, actually, when he was at Magnet Records before the PWL days. So I had quite a bit of experience by the time Stock, Aitken and Waterman came together in '84. And I started at the Marquee in '73, so already had a fair bit of experience engineering and doing dance records and so on at that point. And the first year that Stock, Aitken and Waterman were together was at the Marquee Studios, which is one of the things I point out in the book, because a lot of people think that everything that Stock, Aitken and Waterman did was done at the PWL Studios. But we were a good year or so at the Marquee before we ended up at the PWL Hit Factory, as it got nicknamed.
And you talk in the book about how you sort of made the leap from a steady job that you had at the Marquee to going freelance to work with Stock, Aitken and Waterman.
Yeah.
How big a gamble was that for you personally at the time?
It felt like a big wrench and a big decision, I'd been on the payroll at the Marquee for, must have been best part of 11 years or so up to that point. And to go from a steady income to sort of taking a chance, because Pete said when he started the studio, everyone's going to be freelance, there won't be any steady wages, and everyone's got to pull their weight, and initially I took a dip in earnings, but I was absolutely 100% certain from the records we'd already done together, in particular the Dead or Alive, You Spin Me Round, and the Youthquake album, that there was a lot more to come, from Pete and the boys, and I was one of a number of engineers and technicians that moved and took that chance, moving from the Marquee to PWL, and actually had to sort of break a working contract with the Marquee at that point, which it was, for me personally, it was a little tricky, but I had a good relationship with the managing director of the Marquee studio, Simon White, and I think he could see that it was a good personal career move for me, and we made a deal where I basically promised to keep bringing work and clients back into the Marquee, because even though at that time it was quite traditional still for studios in London to employ engineers, even by the early 80s it had got to the point where engineers were bringing the work in. People would be coming to the studios as much for the engineer and their reputation as for whichever studio they may have been based at.
Yeah.
So
in those early days, with Stock, Aitken and Waterman as a team, could you see that there was a real spark between the three of them? Was Pete kind of clearly in charge in those early days, or was it a bit more equal?
No, he was absolutely in charge.
Right.
He was the captain of the ship, and there was that was established from day one, because he had already had a tremendous amount of success in the industry at that point. Both on his own as an A&R man and promoter, and also as I say, with Pete Collins, he had a long-term production company success with Loose End. And they had done Nick Kershaw and a huge amount of acts up to that point. So it was clearly, Pete was the captain of the ship. Mike and Matt came along looking for an in to the industry. They'd had no real success, a lot of experience up to that point, and that's really the way it always stayed. I mean, they always had an equal billing of Stock, Aitken and Waterman, both as producers and writers, but Pete was the boss.
And as you say, the big breakthrough single was Dead or Alive, with You Spin Me Round, which went to number one, I believe, towards the end of '84. Can you tell us a little bit about how that single came together and your role within it?
Yeah, well, even that year that we spent at the Marquee in '84, I'd really already begun to establish myself as not only as an engineer, but I'd started producing some dance records for some smaller labels, and I was generally kind of coming and going, and even at that time mainly only doing their mixes, like for Divine. And a few other people they were working with, and some other engineers had mixed the Hazel Dean early hits. But with Dead or Alive, I think Pete could see, that with a major label, there was the potential of doing a whole album. They'd already had an earlier hit from their first album, so Pete could smell the potential and the money, as it were, in the project. And we started with 4 tracks, of which Spin Me Round was one. And so Pete basically said to me, "Look, Phil, I need you to, to be on the whole of these sessions. I need you to be the recording engineer and the mixing engineer." So that was a little unusual for me at that point. So pretty quickly, within doing those 4 tracks, which Stock, Aitken Waterman reprogrammed from the band's demos, pretty quickly the Spin Me Round was sounding like the track that was going to be the standout track and the single. But we had some pretty difficult times making that record, especially as we got towards the end of it, because there we were with 4 guys in the band, but really only one of them, Pete Burns, actually performing on the record, in terms of the bass player didn't play bass guitar or even program the bass part, although some of the bass ideas may have been his. Same with the drummer, it was all programmed drums. And the keyboard player had done a very good demo, actually. He was spinning around with a lot of programmed sequences that did end up on the final record, but weren't necessarily his programming. It was, we really kind of remade the demo and took it on a lot further. So as you can imagine, if you've got four guys in a band and only the singer is really truly on the record and heard on the record, that creates a lot of tension with the other guys in the band, wanting to have their opinions heard, wanting to get as involved as possible, and a lot of egos flying around and a lot of tension flying around. By the time we got to the point of like, okay, we've got as many overdubs as we need, and we need to move on to the mix. So I don't, there's not a huge amount about the recording process that I remember, other than being very shocked when Pete Burns got onto the microphone the first time. A huge volume, shall we say, from his voice, and really having to being quite shocked about that. And he was one of those guys. There's only ever two singers I worked with that were like this. That he didn't have a concept of running through, to do a microphone test.
It was full on.
Full on,
yeah.
from the minute he stood behind that microphone, which, as an engineer, that puts you into the mentality of like, oh, I've got to set this up quickly, get the settings, and make sure we start recording, because, singing at that kind of volume, he's probably not going to be able to sing it that many times, So that was a delight, and soon got used to the format of like, there's the settings. As soon as Pete starts singing, we start recording, But the sparks really flew when we hit the mix stage, and I've explained this in depth in the book. But for a lot of engineers, if you've been working, shall we say, all day in recording mode in your head, which we were still doing, and then the producer turns round at, let's say, tea time, 6 or 7 o'clock, and says, now we want to start mixing, and you've already done like the best part of a day's work. It's very difficult for an engineer to kind of within the same day to flip between those two kind of modes. Yeah. Because in my experience, mixing is done best starting the day in what I call mix mode. So you're thinking about how you're going to set the mix up and how you're going to achieve that final mix. So that wasn't good to start with, and pretty much at that point where we started mixing, there was a lot of disagreement between the band and Mike Stock and Matt Aitken. At this point, Pete Waterman wasn't in the room. Regularly, Pete would not be in the room during the recording process. He'd come back, he'd get the session going at the start of it all, and then he'd come back in for the mixes. That was his role as captain of the ship. Yeah. So at that point where we tried to start mixing, I remember Pete Burns and a couple of the other guys in the band saying, they wanted to do more overdubs. They wanted to carry on recording, and Mike and Matt very strongly, Pete says we should be mixing today, so let's get mixing. And if we feel that as Phil builds a mix up, we need some more overdubs, we'll do it. And they just couldn't seem to agree. I was beavering away, getting the mix set up and getting going. And by the time Pete arrived at let's say 7 or 8 o'clock, we were in full blown arguments between the boys in the band. So and Pete walked into this, and as someone fresh walking in and seeing a lot of tension going on, he very rightly said, "Look, guys, take a break, go home. In fact, you all go home. I don't want to hear each side of the story. If Mike and Matt say it's ready for mixing, then I'll sit down with Phil and we'll do the mix, and it'd be better if you're all out the room." And at that point started the mix that didn't finish until the next day, about lunchtime.
Long day for you then.
So, as I've said in the book, it's probably the longest mix of my career, something like 36 hours. Although I suppose the first part of that first day, as I say, was still recording.
A stunning end result, which is
Yeah.
the main thing.
Yeah, I still feel it's probably one of the best mixes of my career, and to this day, it's one of the few records that we still hear pretty regularly from that era. You know, Rick Astley and some of the Kylie stuff gets played a lot, but I'm pretty shocked these days that we don't hear more of the PWL SAW stuff on the radio regularly.
Yeah. And you said in the book that the success that record had, kind of really, you know, without it, there wouldn't have been a PWL hit factory in the years that followed, because Pete wouldn't have been able to necessarily raise the finance that was needed to get you guys going as such.
That's my view, yeah, because financially, Pete always sailed close to the wind, shall we say. It always stunned me, actually, that the amount of success he had had over the years, you know, that he didn't have a stronger financial background, to that point. But he did invest a lot in equipment, as you can tell from, you know, whatever the latest equipment was, you know, the latest Fairlight, the latest PPG synthesizer, and these things all cost, you know, tens of thousands of pounds. So he had at least done that, but I think it needed the confidence of a major record worldwide on a major label for Pete and the boys to say, yeah, okay, we can move out of the Marquee and into our own place, and that's what Dead or Alive and Spin Me Round really did for us.
So as you say, that at the beginning of the next year, 1985, you made that move to set up your own PWL studio complex.
Yeah.
The thrust of which, from the book, seems to have come from Mike Stock, who was quite fiercely of an opinion that you should be completely independent and reliant on nobody.
Yeah, Mike strongly had that view, and I think Pete felt that way, but just probably needed the confidence of the Dead or Alive project and the willingness of Mike and Matt to do that. And at that point, Willie Morrison and a few other people that were working around us, you know, started hunting around London for a suitable premises, and found that in the Vineyard in SE1, where the guy had closed down his main studio and was already in the process of setting up a new studio, but hadn't really got the finance to complete the project, and was probably looking for someone like Pete and Stock Aitken Waterman to come in and say, right, you know, we'll not necessarily get involved in the building work for that first studio that we had, but we'll come in and equip it, you know, and start paying you rent, and that's exactly what happened.
And am I right in thinking that one of the early projects that you undertook in that building was the Princess record?
Yes, yeah, wasn't the first, but it was amongst the early ones where, you know, we took a change of direction musically, you know, from the fast high energy stuff of Dead or Alive and Hazel Dean and so on, into suddenly we went soul R&B, and that came out of the project we were doing with a band called Brilliant, who contained Youth on bass, you know, who was in Killing Joke, funnily enough, but has gone on to be a very well-known producer, and Jimmy Courtier and a few other well-known names. Jimmy and Bill Drummer went on to be KLF. Yeah. And Princess was one of the girls that came in to do backing vocals on that project that we were doing for Warner's, and got on very well with everyone in the building, the boys especially. And Pete felt that it was time to be doing a few of not only their own productions but their own songs, because we'd been doing a lot of producing of other people's songs, you know, for the finance. And so therefore they came up with the song Say I'm Your Number One, and asked Princess, who'd been doing those backing vocal sessions, to come in and do it, and came together very quickly. And interestingly, Pete was away for most of that week. And I'm not saying that's why it worked so well at all, but it allowed the freedom, shall we say, for Mike and Matt to get on with it, and present what was already, before Pete left, it was very strongly plotted, as we say, in terms of the structure of the song and the groove of the song, were very firmly plotted between the guys, so that by the time Pete came back, vocals were done and the production was pretty much finished and ready to mix.
And it was also quite a crucial recording in that it kind of led Pete to start thinking about, setting up his own label rather than producing work or writing songs that were then going to be released on other labels.
For others, yeah. Very much coming from Mike and Matt again, especially Mike Stock, not only feeling we should be in our own studio and be working independently, but also not working for other labels and acts that have got their own songs. So, yeah, I guess Princess was the first amongst what became a long run. And although Supreme Records, which was the label that Pete helped Nick East set up, wasn't actually PWL, wasn't actually Pete, because at the time Pete was so busy trying to develop everything else in the building, he felt, maybe I should get someone experienced at running a small label in to run a label in-house. And Nick East had previously been at Proto Records, who had Divine and Hazel Dean, and it was a perfect opportunity. I mean, great timing again, that he was keen to start something like that, but didn't really have the acts or the offices and facilities, but nevertheless he had the promotional experience and the wherewithal of how to launch an independent label. So it was that was a perfect match again. So he came in and was given space within the building, and our first success, I guess, were Princess and Supreme Records.
And it seemed during those days that things were happening at almost a breakneck pace in terms of the company moving forward.
Yeah.
As you said, you were kind of very keen on using the latest technology, doing the extra mixes and things like that. Was there a sense there that what you were doing was almost breaking new ground in a way?
Yeah. We wanted to and felt we were breaking new ground in all three areas, really. The technology, the mixes, and creatively, because there weren't, at that time there were a few British soul R&B groups around, but there weren't too many acts and producers around that were kind of taking on the Shep Pettibones and the Americans that were doing a similar sound at the same time, and doing Princess and moving on from there, and all those mixes, as you say, that we did for Princess. So, and we almost became an in-house joke, but we were able to move fast enough from the point of view that Pete and Nick East would be out hearing the latest club records that were coming in, and within a week we could do yet another remix on a Princess record, and almost lay it on a plate for the DJs that if they're playing heavily a record that's just come in from the States, a week later they'd have a Princess remix that's got that same beat and that same groove, but with the Princess pop song on top, so that they could just kind of automatically mix it into their program. And again, not many people were around could move fast enough to do that, and Nick East really helped us to put all the things in place to do that, both promotionally and manufacturing wise. Yeah,
so as we move into '86, Mellin Kim, the two very bubbly sisters from London, enter the PWL fray.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that they brought something a little bit different to what you already had, both in terms of their personality and the sound that you eventually created for them?
Yeah. I think Mel and Kim are probably the first example of Stock Aitken Waterman really saying, we won't just necessarily, write some songs that sound like the latest American things coming in or whatever. and we'll go with that. They took the view of, meeting the artists, getting to know them in a pretty quick space of time, and saying, well, let's write material that suits the character of the artist. And of course, that really paid dividend in how they went on and worked with Kylie and other people like that. But Mellin were probably the first, in as much as we were working on a fairly straight ahead, princess sounding soul R&B track called System. That was the first thing we were working on with them. And I think Pete and Mike in particular kind of knew and felt, well, this is not, it's okay, but it's not really representative of these crazy East End girls that have been coming in the last couple of weeks, who just like bouncing around the place, and and it's a pretty cool sounding soul R&B track. Why don't we think about coming up with something with a bit more energy, and a bit more kind of UK European sounding club rather than American soul R&B type of sound. And literally, we're told that Nick East was manufacturing that record, getting ready to release it, and suddenly Chicago House records started hitting London and Manchester and so on, and that sparked Pete to say, right, let's, he called Nick East and said, let's put System on hold, and within a week we'll turn around a new record that both shows the character of the girls and matches it with this latest American new club sound that's come in, and hence we had what we didn't realise at the time, but has since been called London House. We didn't call it that at the time, and I've only found out since that that's what people started calling it. So it was kind of a mixture of a London sound using the beats on the Chicago House records.
And you talk in the book about how their number one hit, Respectable, was, when you were going out to clubs, you were hearing it played alongside those Chicago House records, and really standing up in comparison to them.
Yeah, that's what we felt. And I mean, Showing Out was the first one which did well, and it caused that moving on to Respectable, which was a better song and a better record, but it caused that thing that we call follow-up-itis, which I talk about sometimes in the book, where everyone knew they had a great record, but no one seemed to be able to make the decision on the first mix to come out. But once we finally cracked that, yes, it was mix after mix, and it was great for me at times when I managed to get out of the studio and into some clubs and hear what was going on. And I specifically remember with Respectable, must have been out around the summertime, going on holiday to Ibiza, and exactly as you say, hearing it in a club, being very smoothly mixed in and out of a couple of Chicago House records, and I think the thing, for me and probably for all of us, the thing that stood out for us is we would use that groove and the beats and so on, influenced by them, but we'd put on top a much hookier pop song, and that was a sort of an interesting meeting that made something that was being talked about a lot and played a lot move from the underground to being really commercial and being in the charts. Some people will say, oh, we ruined the house sound, but we view that we just took it to a different place,
And also arriving in '86 was Rick Astley, who went on, of course, to have major success during '87.
Yeah.
But I think his actual introduction into the building was quite low-key, in a way.
Yeah, very low-key, to the point where many of us genuinely thought he was the new T-Boy. Because Pete had sort of failed to tell everyone that actually this is an artist I've signed, and I've brought him down to London just to kind of get used to the environment of the studio, and rather than just sitting in the corner of the studio, he was tasked with sort of making the tea and getting the sandwiches, and so for those of us working in the studios that hadn't been told he was an artist, that's what we thought, no sugar for me, thanks, Rick. And that went on for a few months before finally the message got through to everybody that, actually he's here to write some songs and do his own demos and move on to being an artist.
And even when he'd actually recorded Never Gonna Give You Up, which was his breakthrough hit single, #1 in the UK and the US, Pete wasn't actually kind of overly keen on releasing it at first.
I don't think anyone was particularly sure about it. In its initial recording, and I've since discovered that I did the first mix of it, even to the level of a club 12-inch mix. People weren't sure about it. I don't think Stock Aitken Waterman was sure about it. Rick was the first of the PWL artists that got signed to a label outside of Supreme or whatever we had going on internally, and he was signed to RCA Records. So then the opinion of Pete Robinson, the A&R guy at RCA Records, also came into play. And to be honest, I don't really know. It was a track that was completed and was left sitting around for a few months. And in the meantime, it was thought, well, let's try something else with Rick. And we did a duet with Rick and Lisa, a sort of local South London singer called Lisa, who and Ian Kernow and myself wrote that song, and that in fact was the first release through RCA, and it was viewed that this will again be good experience for Rick, in terms of it'll get Rick out doing PAs and performing, and it did quite well on the club circuit, but didn't have any kind of commercial success. And the story goes that Pete heard what must have been my initial 12-inch mix of Never Gonna Give You Up at the Christmas party we had. Must have been 86.
Yeah.
And hadn't realised who it was or what it was, right. and went over and asked Tops, our club promoter who's DJing, and said, "Oh, who's that? What's..." That's the way the stories come back to me from various other people. I haven't actually heard that from Pete himself, but Pete was told, "Well, that's Rick's record that's been done and is sitting around at the moment." And at that point, Pete went back in with Pete Hammond and started remixing it, and then it got reworked with Pete Hammond, and quite a few overdubs were changed. And what we now kind of know from that record are those sort of wonderful string and brass lines that were on it, which were actually Fairlight samples that Ian Kernow did, were added afterwards as well. And then the rest is history, really.
Yeah. So moving on into 87, you say in the book that you consider that to be the peak year for you personally of PWL, even though in 88, 89 you actually had sort of more hit record sales, etc.
Yeah.
Why did you feel like that?
Well, I felt it was our creative peak, because by 87, having had that success with Rick, and it was, tremendous worldwide success with, 2 #1 singles in America, and Never Gonna Give You Up being #1 in pretty much every territory in the world. And, it was considered a very big thing to be #1 in America as well. Although we'd had a #1 prior to that with Bananarama, with the cover of Venus, to have it with something that was a Stock Aitken Waterman song as well, just was tremendous elation. And I think at that point, we still had, totally without any kind of question about it, the full support of all the UK, European and American DJs with the work we were putting out, the different styles of mixes and the very forward-looking mixes. That everything was, because everything we did in the building, like I was saying with the Princess scenario, was always done with the DJs in mind. Are we satisfying the DJs? Are we missing a trick that we're not doing something that the DJs would like on this record? And hence we there were so many mixes around of different things, and if America asked for a different style mix, it was done. So up to 87 and through 87, we still had what I would call complete respect from the clubs and the rest of the media, and that's why I view it as our peak year creatively, because after that we began to lose that once Kylie was signed, and PWL Records really began to take off commercially. So
as you say, Kylie came along towards the end of 87. Obviously she went on to be PWL's biggest artist.
Yeah.
But I think at the time that she actually came in, she wasn't kind of necessarily a big priority within the building, and that the recording of that big breakthrough single, I Should Be So Lucky, nearly didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, in my research for the book, I've picked up 3 different stories and versions of what happened that week, and it's really for the reader to make up their own mind, But for sure, we can say that Kylie had taken time out of her neighbour's TV shooting schedule to come over and make a record with Stock Aitken Waterman, and interestingly, she'd already had a hit record in Australia. Must have been that year, I guess, prior to that, right. With one of our assistants that we'd sent out to Australia to give the Australian company Mushroom some guide into what we were doing in the UK. So she'd had a hit with The Locomotion, which was produced by Duffy in Australia, and that didn't really mean much to any of us in London as such, and I think none of us particularly were aware of Neighbours in the studio. So it was one of those things where I guess Pete Waterman and David Howes had done the deal with the the Australian company that had signed Kylie, made the arrangements to bring her over. But in terms of what that meant to all of us in the studio, didn't register. And of course, one of the reasons it didn't register is because we were so busy. Like a daily schedule for Mike and Matt in the studio and myself downstairs is anything up to sort of 4 to 6 tracks, possibly even for different projects, could be worked on within a day in each studio. And Pete, knowing, Pete being the captain and driving the ship, knowing how busy Mike and Matt are, I guess the last thing on his mind is that, if you're doing Bananarama and you're doing another Mellin Kim or a Rick Astley mix or something, and Samantha Fox is in, and then we're doing this and that, and he didn't want to. I think he didn't want to trouble them with yet another new project that was meant to be happening that week. And so the story goes that he had failed to let Mike and Matt know that this Australian artist was over, only had that week, and was expecting to have a song written and produced while she was there. And by the time it hit the end of the week, and as I say, David Howes was very much involved in looking after Kylie and her manager, and trying to sort of shield them from the fact that the boys were too busy.
Who's the MD?
David Howes was the MD of PWL. And by the time we got to the Friday, and Pete had done his usual disappearing up to his house up north, and apparently he had still failed to tell the boys at that time that they needed to get a song written and recorded with Kylie before she went home, either Friday evening or the Saturday, whatever it was. So there we have it. It was, fine. David Howes had to go into the studio, and he'd pretty much been banned from the studio for for various reasons. I mean, you got one captain of the ship, and in particular, the format was that Pete would drive what Mike and Matt were doing on a daily basis, and they were under so much pressure, as I say, with so many projects going on, that the last thing you want is getting instructions from all sorts of different angles. So it was completely the right way to be running at that time. But David Howells had to go in on that Friday and say to the boys, look, I know I don't normally come in here uninvited. Normally he'd come in and listen to when something's finished or whatever, but had to point out the situation. And they'd been trying to raise Pete on the phone. And so Kylie was brought in that last day, and I Should Be So Lucky was created. I wasn't in the room at the time. I was downstairs doing something else, but I can imagine that it was very much a case of created section by section and recorded line by line. And we are told in one version of the story that Kylie came out of the studio confused as to what was what on the song, because obviously the guys were writing it on the fly. And as you can imagine, if you're under pressure to write a song, you're probably going to write it in different sections, and then come in and record the chorus, Kylie, or now come in and record these lines for the verse. They may not even have known. Well, certainly she left not knowing which bit was which bit and what the whole song sounded like. And we're told that she didn't show it to the boys, obviously, but was quite angry about that.
And out of all that chaos,
out of that chaos,
a number one record,
yet again, a number one record, and whatever chaos and anger may have been caused was soon forgotten about. Yeah.
And you speak at length in the book about how when that success started to happen with Kylie, that in a way it kind of started to change the sound of records that were coming out of PWL, and that you kind of went much more straight up pop orientated.
We went straight ahead pop, and that's what I mean about the creativity of '87 in particular. I think a lot of the records that were done in '87, you can still say had full credibility. Excuse me, with all the dance circles, and although we did get some credibility back with later Kylie records, to have come off the blocks with something as out and out pop and, shall we say, cheesy as I Should Be So Lucky, and that sound didn't really change for some time. Obviously, the DJs in the clubs criticised it, and it's like, well, what do we do with this? How do you do a club mix of a credible club mix of I Should Be So Lucky? And
do you think that there was almost whether it be conscious or not, a change towards heading for things that were going to be chart successes rather than necessarily cutting edge in terms of their sound?
Oh, absolutely. At that point, Pete's old DJ friend and A&R sparring partner from Magnet Records, Tilly Rutherford, had come in to help Pete and Tilly run the label and run the company. And Tilly was a club person through and through, but also very, very pop and very outspoken, like Pete as well. And I think that when the first time it struck me that not only have we lost the clubs and the DJs and our credibility within that, but the first time it struck me that that was no longer on the agenda for Pete and for Tilly and David, was the DMC, that's the Dance Music Club or Dance Music Championship. They used to run the DJ championships every year. They started to have a one-day London conference, a bit like the New Music Seminar, which is very popular in America for all the dance people, where they'd get people together and they'd get panels together and so on, and have a day's conference and so on. And Ian and I used to go across to the American one quite a lot. So it was either 88 or 89, probably 88. We'd gone to the one in London, and I'd got to know quite a few of American DJs and top remixers by being at those conferences, and they'd come to this one in London, and I was absolutely astounded to hear Tilly answer to questions about, well, what's going on with PWL, why has it gone so pop, where's the club mixes for Kylie and so on, and Tilly's answer was well, we don't need you anymore, we've gone pop, we've gone completely commercial. And I guess that that was what was in the minds of pretty much everybody involved, shall we say. We had this kind of little bit of an upstairs downstairs divide, because at that point Ian and I were, Ian Kerno and myself, were downstairs and riding high as kind of top UK remixers and doing all sorts of club and dance remixes for other artists,
outside of
PWL, Pet Shop Boys, and all sorts of American remixes and so on. But it's when I heard Tilly say that publicly, that a little, like, something finally clicked in my mind. I was like, oh God, well, it's one thing for that sort of thing to be going on, but it's another thing when you're questioned by the dance fraternity in public to actually say, well, we don't need you anymore and we don't care about you.
But it was the furrow that rightly or wrongly, the company ploughed. I mean, certainly rightly in terms of chart success.
Yeah.
I mean, through 88 and then into 89, I mean, you had Jason Donovan also coming out of Neighbours and being a big star.
Yeah.
And I think 89, you actually had 7 number one singles. And amazingly, a quarter of all the records sold in the UK that year were PWL.
Yeah. Pete and David and Tilly, in that order, I would say, were after chart domination. Certainly in the UK, if not worldwide. And what developed further out of all of that is this kind of rivalry, because obviously the major labels didn't like it. The major that kind of percentage that you talk about, reported in Music Week and reported in the press, and of course the UK executives of the major labels have got their bosses in America screaming down the phone, what's this fucking PWL with 25%? What are you guys doing over there?
Yeah.
Why can't you compete with them? And again, at an industry conference, it struck me again, it was probably 88, 89, when an American executive came over and hailed the job that David and Pete and everyone at PWL had done in getting that kind of percentage, with independent distribution as well. So by the time we got to, let's say, the end of 88 into 89, and we're competing for the Christmas number one, and as you say, number one's all over. It was almost like a failure if you didn't get to number one with Kylie or a new artist. There was this feeling which, I don't think it wasn't something we were conscious of so much in the studios, which is why, I've written, as it were, from the factory floor, and I've not really talked too much about how PWL was perceived in the media and all of that, but there was a very conscious effort to compete with the majors, to get up their noses, to rub it into them, and hence we had this kind of series of Music Week articles. Have you seen those adverts?
Yes.
Series of Music Week adverts where you've got which were very cleverly done and very well constructed, where you saw, Pete and David Howes blowing their own trumpet, putting yet more gold records up on the wall, and putting the kind of stats in of the success we were achieving. You can't. I've kind of criticised it in the book in terms of, that was in a way the start of the end. In as much as that, what I'm saying is basically we became arrogant.
Yeah.
Became arrogant by leaving the club DJs and all those people that had built us up from 84 through to 87 to that success, and just kind of saying, oh, we don't need you now, now we've got all this, But of course, unfortunately it was short lived. Really.
And it seems as though it actually, right in the midst of that pop success in '89, Pete and other members of the team were kind of starting to realise that
Yeah.
you know, without that credibility in the clubs and with the dance music scene, that
You can't just keep churning out cheesy pop
Yeah.
with the same sound time and time again and keep having success for 5-10 years. Just not going to happen.
Albums like Kylie's third album in particular, by that point, Pete was almost on you guys to say, look, let's go back to the old way of doing it, because we need to get this credibility back.
Yeah. Pete was first to spot it, you know, possibly with Tilly as well, but you know, I don't know what clicked in Pete's mind to make that turn, but he became fairly desperate to win back that credibility and that success from the ground level, as it were, from the clubs upwards, because, you know, when you've got that, you can take it all the way through to commercial success, but you can't really have commercial success and guarantee that the clubs will just follow you, you know. So we entered a kind of, let's say, a 2 or 3 year period where it seemed like everyone was against us. The clubs were against us, the media turned against us, the rest of the industry was against us, and yet, you know, we were still signing artists and having number ones, and you know, it's difficult to look into a crystal ball and say, well, you know, this isn't going to last, and we've got to do something. But something obviously clicked for Pete, and suddenly, you know, we were back into working like, let's do the club mix first. Don't care how commercial the song is, we'll do a club mix, we'll make it credible, we'll get it into the clubs, and then if there's a commercial pop song on top of it, then we make it fit somehow.
And of course, that was, as you've written about at length in the book, very difficult to actually get that credibility back once you've lost it.
Yeah, I'm not sure we ever got it back. That's and I think that's why from let's say late '90 into '91, you know, it unfortunately it was a downward spiral. You know, the whole story is this wonderful upward spiral through the club's commercial success, and then unfortunately, you know, a downward spiral where you know, Matt was first to leave, Matt Aitken in '91. Ian and I left in '92. Pete Hammond had already left the building by then, and you know, Pete and Mike Stock, you know, bravely carried on for a while, and eventually Mike Stock left as well. So it's and yet Pete came back later on in the '90s with Steps. You know, Pete's a tremendously determined and gritty character that you know, had ridden through success and then the loss of that success previously in his career, and just had this tremendous ability, you know, to keep coming back, because, as I say, he was at the top of his game when he was partners with Peter Collins, you know, and that kind of ended in they're still good friends, but a little bit of a mess when they tried to do the Musical Youth follow-up in America. I think I've briefly written about that. But, you know, but then to find Stock Aitken Waterman and have all of that and go through, it's yeah,
He's a survivor.
oh, he's definitely a survivor, you know, and you know, still a wonderful character, and that he achieved success again with Steps later on, as I say, just says it all. And I think, you know, one of the things about the PWL Stock Aitken Waterman era also is, you know, as much as people criticise us a lot and criticise a lot of the records, you couldn't criticise the fact that the same writing and production team could go from artist to artist to artist and still have tremendous success.
Yeah.
You know, whether they're finding and creating that artist, or whether they're reviving a career of a Donna Summer or something like that. I think the greatest thing about it is that you know, Pete set out to achieve. I don't think he ever verbalised it, but set out to achieve a UK Motown, and the commercial peaks that we've talked about in '88 and '89. you'd be hard pushed to say he hadn't achieved it.
So, looking back now with sort of 20 years distance from the end of the PWL days, I mean, how would you sum it up, the experience from your own personal point of view?
Well, the experience is something I wouldn't have wanted to have missed. So I'm very glad I made that decision to to leave the Marquee and go with Pete and the boys. Tremendously exciting period. It almost kind of almost went too fast. How can 10 years or 8 years or whatever it was go so quickly? So glad to have been there and to have been involved, and probably now wished I'd maybe taken more notes and more photographs. The book's very much based on diary, events, invoices, and quite a few interviews with other people and so on. And I was inspired to write the book after reading Pete's and Mike's, just feeling it would be good to give people another view, and I feel privileged to have been in that position, to give a view from the factory floor, as it were, because when you're in that kind of team, you get a good team spirit going, as I've said, as we particularly had going, amongst all the studio people. But Pete was very good at nurturing that, getting everybody together for celebrations and celebrating birthdays and hit records and all the rest of it. And every time we had a number one, we had a party. So there were plenty of parties and cakes. So just fantastic, really. That for me, to have been there through that period and to have picked up enough experience that then allowed me to go on in the 90s and run my own studio with Ian and have further success.
Well, thanks very much, Phil, for coming in. It's been fascinating talking through the PWL story. And don't forget, the book, PWL from the Factory Floor, is available now. Join us again soon for more Cherry Red TV.